What if the most spiritual man in the world's most famous band wasn't quite the saint we made him out to be? What if the quiet Beatle was never truly quiet but just quietly dangerous? In a world obsessed with redemption arcs, peace signs, and sitars, it's tempting to remember George Harrison as the wise soul who transcended the madness of rock and roll. The man who brought Indian mysticism to the West, who shunned ego, and who, by all accounts, just wanted to meditate in peace. But beneath the incense and mantras, there are darker chords at play, chords few dare to acknowledge. Because what if behind the gentle facade, there lived a man tormented by jealousy, betrayal, and a hunger for validation that sometimes bordered on cruelty? This isn't a takedown. It's not a tabloid hit piece, but it's also not a fairy tale. This is an excavation, one that begins with a guitar-strumming teenager from Liverpool and ends with a man bleeding from 40 stab wounds in his own home. A man who survived not just Beatlemania and heartbreak, but his own contradictions. Welcome to Tragedy Uncovered, where we peel back the veil of legend to reveal the raw, unresolved truths beneath. And today, we're asking a question many fans have tiptoed around for decades. Was George Harrison really the enlightened one? Or was he simply the best at hiding the chaos within? Stick with us to the very end, because the answer may not be what you expect. And if you appreciate content that challenges the popular narrative, don't forget to subscribe, like this video, and leave your thoughts in the comments. We're here to uncover the truth, especially the parts that history tried to bury. Let's begin. It's hard to think of George Harrison without picturing serenity, eyes half closed in meditation, sitar in hand, radiating calm. But Harrison's life, from beginning to end, was anything but tranquil. And like most complex men, the signs were there early. Born in Liverpool in 1943, at least officially George was the youngest of 4 children. But true to form, even his birth date would eventually become a contradiction. In the 1980s, he fabricated a fake hospital document claiming he was born a day earlier. Was it a joke? A prank? Maybe. But it confused historians so much that even the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame changed their records. George loved to be unpredictable, untethered from the expected. And from the start, his relationship with truth, identity, and perception would never be straightforward. He fell in love with music the way many do, by accident. Riding a bike one day in 1956, he heard Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel blasting from a house, and just like that, the trajectory of his life was altered. His mother, who believed in the power of music to shape the soul, scraped together what she could to buy him his first guitar. It would become an extension of his body, and eventually, the vehicle for both his liberation and his frustration. At 15, George auditioned for a band called the Quarrymen, led by a brash teenager named John Lennon. Lennon thought Harrison was too young. It was Paul McCartney, already sensing George's raw talent, who gave him a second chance this time. On the top deck of a moving bus, George played his solo so well that Lennon couldn't deny him any longer. It's a fitting origin for a man who would never take the easy route. George didn't climb stairs, she leapt onto moving vehicles. As the Beatles took shape, Harrison stood slightly to the side musically and emotionally. Lennon and McCartney were the twin suns in the creative solar system, their names stamped onto nearly every song. Harrison, meanwhile, quietly experimented, absorbing influences from outside the typical rock orbit. Indian music, Hinduism, vegetarianism, meditation, soaked it in, then poured it into his guitar. But make no mistake, this wasn't just spiritual curiosity. It was also displacement. While Lennon and McCartney bathed in the limelight, George often felt like a guest in his own band. Even as he wrote masterful songs, Here Comes the Sun, Something, Taxman, he was met with indifference. His contributions, though brilliant, were frequently sidelined or outright rejected. By 1966, George was no longer the quiet Beatle, he was the quietly seething Beatle. And that rage, however subtle, would slowly surface in ways no sitar could soften. He married model Pattie Boyd in 1966 after an almost impulsive courtship. She thought he was shy. He proposed almost out of nowhere. The mystery intrigued her. But as their marriage unfolded, Pattie would find herself navigating a man torn between sacred ideals and rockstar indulgence. By the late 1960s, the contradictions began to pile up. While preaching about Krishna's path of detachment, George was drinking, partying, and cheating, while chanting mantras about self-control. He was drowning in cocaine and chasing multiple women, including, eventually, the wife of his best friend, Ringo Starr. And this, perhaps, is where the image of the peaceful mystic begins to crumble under closer inspection. Because George Harrison wasn't just spiritual, he was also selfish. He wasn't just enlightened, he was evasive. He wasn't just betrayed by others, he was more than capable of betrayal himself. In 1969, George's home was raided by British authorities who found hashish in his shoe. His reaction? That same evening, he and Pattie strolled into a royal party and mingled with Princess Margaret. Harrison even considered asking for a favor to smooth over the charges. That's not a man afraid of consequences. That's a man who knew how to dance with them. The public didn't always notice. Critics lauded his music. Fans adored his mystique. But beneath the incense and silence, there was a storm building, one that would eventually explode not on stage, but in private rooms, behind locked doors, in whispered conversations that would fracture the Beatles and George's personal life for good. We'll go deeper into those moments, the betrayals, the fallout, the impossible contradictions in the next segment. But before we continue, pause and ask yourself, can a man carry both wisdom and hypocrisy in equal measure? And if so, which one do we remember? Stay with us. As the 1960s barreled toward their chaotic end, George was no longer content being the third wheel in the Lennon-McCartney machine. And to be fair, by that point, his songwriting had more than earned him a seat at the table. Here Comes the Sun wasn't just a pretty melody, it was a cry for space, for clarity, written during a brief escape from the band's inner turmoil. Something, the ballad that even Frank Sinatra praised as the greatest love song ever written, wasn't just a hit, it was proof that Harrison wasn't a backup player. He was a genuine force. But instead of being embraced, his contributions were often met with resistance. Inside the Beatles' orbit, creativity had become territorial. Lennon and McCartney, whose partnership once thrived on mutual energy, had grown increasingly insular. George's ideas, no matter how inspired, were routinely dismissed or diluted. In the Get Back documentary, you can witness the sting in real time, McCartney correcting, controlling, even accusing Harrison of vamping, a term that reduced his input to empty noodling. Harrison's silence in response speaks volumes. It wasn't the silence of agreement, it was the silence of surrender, or perhaps calculation. The tipping point came during the sessions for the White Album. Tension was boiling. Ringo walked out for 2 weeks. Lennon was bringing Yoko Ono into the studio daily, disrupting the creative flow. Paul was growing more controlling. George, increasingly emboldened by his time with Bob Dylan and the band in Woodstock, found himself envying their democratic process. They were equals, not emperors. They collaborated without hierarchy. Compared to that, the Beatles felt like a kingdom, one where he was permanently stuck in the role of court musician. Eventually, George had enough. He walked out, not metaphorically, literally. Mid-session, frustrated and overlooked, he packed up and left. Lennon's reaction? Cold and cutting. He suggested they replace Harrison with Eric Clapton. That comment, though casually made, cut deep. It wasn't just insulting, it was revealing. For all the Beatle brotherhood talk, there was always an invisible hierarchy, and George knew exactly where he stood. But he did return 5 days later. They smoothed things over just enough to finish Let It Be, perform their iconic rooftop concert, and put a bow on the end of an era. On the outside, it seemed like a reconciliation, but on the inside, something had shifted permanently. George wasn't just fed up, was ready to move on. And he had a vault of unreleased songs that proved he didn't need the Beatles to make music that mattered. When the band finally broke up, it was like a dam had burst for Harrison. Within months, he released All Things Must Pass, a triple album of staggering ambition and emotional clarity. Songs that had been buried, shelved, or ignored during Beatles sessions were now set free, and the world finally saw the full scope of his artistry. Critics were floored. Some even called him the real genius behind the Beatles. For a man so often denied space, he suddenly had all of it. But if Harrison's creative life soared post-Beatles, his personal life began to crack. His marriage to Pattie, Boyd, once the dream pairing of model and mystic, was starting to corrode under pressure. For one, the couple had struggled with fertility. Boyd later admitted that discovering she couldn't have children was devastating. George, instead of offering comfort, flatly refused to consider adoption. To him, that wasn't an option, whether it stemmed from ego, fear, or something else entirely. The decision widened the emotional gulf between them. Worse still, George's spiritual devotion was starting to look more like performance than practice. Inspired by the Hindu god Krishna, often depicted surrounded by a harem, George began to justify his infidelities as some sort of divine expression. He wasn't just cheating, was following Krishna's path. Pattie wasn't buying it, and neither should we. Because when spirituality becomes a shield for personal irresponsibility, it stops being faith and starts becoming manipulation. And then came the betrayal that would shatter everything. Pattie discovered George was having an affair. That in itself was not entirely new. But this time, it wasn't just any woman. It was Maureen Starkey, Ringo Starr's wife. Think about that. He didn't just betray his own marriage. He betrayed one of the few bandmates who had ever truly stood by him. According to Boyd, she confronted George after finding photographs and catching Maureen at their house during studio sessions. One night, she pounded on the locked bedroom door, only to hear laughter from inside. When George opened the door, his excuse was a slap in the face. "She's just resting." Boyd didn't let it go. She went directly to Ringo and told him the truth. His fury was explosive and justified. But George didn't stop there. At a dinner party the very next evening, he announced, loudly and without shame, "I'm in love with Maureen." The room fell silent. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was theatrical. Even John Lennon, not exactly a poster boy for fidelity, later compared the situation to a taboo so profound he wouldn't say it aloud. And just like that, the bond between the Beatles, whatever remained of it, was fractured beyond repair. George filed for divorce soon after, on New Year's Eve. No less. A symbolic ending, perhaps. But what followed was hardly a new beginning. The unraveling we witnessed on the Dark Horse tour wasn't just about a strained voice or misplaced creative ambition. It was the embodiment of a man stretched to his spiritual, emotional, and physical limits. And for the first time since stepping into the post-Beatles spotlight, George Harrison was beginning to show cracks that no mantra could conceal. In 1974, George launched his first solo tour across North America. And to say it didn't go as planned would be putting it mildly. He was determined to distance himself from Beatles nostalgia, refusing to play many of the group's classics or worse, rewriting the lyrics to songs like "While My Guitar Gently Weeps," alienating fans who had come to hear the music they loved. And then there was his voice. Ravaged by laryngitis, George rasped and croaked his way through every performance, leaving audiences confused and disappointed. It wasn't just the vocals. It was the energy. The man who had once channeled stillness now radiated agitation. Instead of peace, there was defensiveness. Instead of enlightenment, frustration. The very tour that was supposed to mark his rebirth only highlighted his disconnection from the audience, from the press, and perhaps from himself. In private, things weren't any better. George was deep in a spiral of substance use. Pattie Boyd, even after their separation, recalled his increasing reliance on cocaine, how it froze his emotions, sharpened his edges, and turned moments of tenderness into acts of cruelty. Friends and associates noted the stark shift in his behavior, one moment deeply introspective, the next dismissive and explosive. This period at Friar Park, his sprawling Gothic mansion west of London, became infamous among those in his inner circle. What was supposed to be a retreat into nature and peace turned into something closer to a fever dream, described as wild, inebriated chaos. The estate saw everything from wild parties to emotional breakdowns behind gilded gates. George's second wife, Olivia, would later refer to this period as insane, not romanticized rockstar rebellion, but deeply unstable living. Yet, amid this chaos, Harrison did something almost unbelievable. He created one of the most critically acclaimed albums ever produced by a former Beatle. All Things Must Pass wasn't just a good album, it was monumental. A triple album, no less, filled with songs the Beatles had never made room for. In it, Harrison sounded freer, wiser, and somehow more grounded than ever. It was his triumph, his exhale. But success has a strange way of exposing wounds instead of healing them. Despite critical and commercial acclaim, George remained elusive, often emotionally distant, and hard to pin down. He seemed caught between wanting the public to take him seriously and resenting them for paying attention. This paradox became especially visible in how he handled personal relationships. After the implosion of his marriage to Boyd, Harrison began a new chapter with Olivia Arias, a young woman working for his record label. Their connection, at first, seemed like Pattie. An astrologer even warned George that a dark-haired woman would soon enter his life. And sure enough, Olivia did. They married in 1978, just weeks after the birth of their only son, Donnie. And for a brief moment, it appeared that Harrison had finally found the peace he'd been searching for, a partner who understood the rhythms of his mind, and a son to give his life new meaning. But even in this quieter chapter, the shadows never really disappeared. Then came December 8th, 1980, the night John Lennon was murdered in New York City. The world stood still. Fans cried. Artists paid tribute. Cities held vigils. But Harrison's response? Cold. Detached. According to Olivia, she woke him in the middle of the night to tell him the news. George, in a haze, rolled over and went back to sleep. And when I woke up, he later said, it was still true. His words weren't cruel, but they weren't tender either. They were raw, unfiltered, and deeply revealing of how complicated his relationship with Lennon had become. In one of Lennon's final interviews, he had dismissed George as a bitter young follower who resented him like a son resents a father who abandoned the family. That metaphor wasn't random, it was targeted, surgical. And George, ever the anti-confrontational one, never publicly lashed out. Instead, he wrote, the song, All Those Years Ago, was George's tribute to Lennon, but even it carried a double edge. Among the heartfelt lyrics was a line that stood out. I always looked up to you. Some interpreted it as sincere. Others as a passive-aggressive farewell, an elegant middle finger cloaked in harmony. And that's exactly the kind of ambiguity George specialized in. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, George drifted in and out of the public eye. He formed the Traveling Wilburys with Bob Dylan, Tom Petty, Roy Orbison, and Jeff Lynne, a group that allowed him to collaborate without hierarchy, something he had craved since the Beatles. He also focused on film production, helping to bankroll Monty Python's Life of Brian and other passion projects. Yet even as his professional life steadied, his health began to falter. In 1997, he discovered a lump while gardening at Friar Park. It turned out to be throat cancer. Doctors removed it, and for a while, things seemed under control. But George had been a lifelong smoker, and the damage was catching up. He battled not just cancer, but his own mortality and perhaps the lingering regret of a life lived both too fast and too guarded. Then came the night that redefined everything. December 30th, 1999. A mentally unstable intruder broke into Friar Park in the dead of night, armed with a knife and a delusion. He believed Harrison was somehow evil, and that killing him was a divine mission. What followed was nothing short of a horror scene. The attacker stabbed George over 40 times. His lungs were punctured. His chest was split open. And yet, he survived. Why? Because Olivia Harrison, George's wife, fought like hell. She grabbed a fireplace poker and beat the attacker until he was subdued. It was primal, fierce, heroic, and deeply ironic. The man who once shrouded himself in spiritual armor had been saved not by prayer, but by a woman wielding steel. In the aftermath, George joked about the attack. Humor had always been his way of coping, but the scars, physical and emotional, never fully healed. If the near-fatal stabbing in 1999 exposed George Harrison's physical vulnerability, it also pulled back the curtain on something far deeper: the fragility of the peace he had spent decades constructing. For a man so famously private, the attack on Friar Park was a grotesque intrusion into a world he had worked tirelessly to keep sacred. And yet, the public saw it through the lens of irony. The quiet Beatle, the spiritual one, nearly killed in a frenzy of violence inside his own home. There was something almost Shakespearean about a tragic climax to a life spent balancing between calm and chaos. But it wasn't the end. Not yet. George Harrison lived nearly 2 more years after that night. Though his health continued to decline, the cancer returned, this time more aggressive, more persistent. He sought treatment in Switzerland, then the U.S., trying both traditional medicine and spiritual approaches. By now, he wasn't chasing fame. He wasn't chasing hits. He was chasing time. And that chase, in many ways, revealed more about Harrison's character than any tour or album ever could. He didn't go out with a final show or a grand farewell. He didn't film a documentary or record an elegy. Instead, he turned inward. He spent time with his wife, his son Donnie, and a small circle of close friends. He meditated. He accepted. And for the first time in a long time, he let go of the contradictions. No sitar, no spectacle, just silence. And when the end came on November 29th, 2001, there was no screaming, no public hysteria. The world mourned, but not in the chaotic, uncontrollable way they had when Lennon died. George's passing was different, softer, more internalized, almost peaceful. But that peace didn't erase the complexities. Olivia Harrison later described her husband's final moments as extraordinary. She claimed that when George left his body, something happened in the room, something visible. She said the space lit up, not metaphorically, but literally. It was, in her words, profound. To skeptics, it was mystical embellishment. To believers, it was confirmation that Harrison had achieved something very few ever do: conscious departure. Regardless of what one believes, there's no denying that George Harrison's death stirred something in people, something more than nostalgia. There was a sense that we had lost someone who had truly tried to figure it all out. Not always successfully, not without contradiction, but earnestly. That sincerity mattered. But sincerity isn't sainthood. And as we look back, with the benefit of time and distance, we're left with a puzzle that doesn't quite fit together. George Harrison was a man who preached spiritual detachment, yet held grudges that lasted decades. He sang about love and truth, yet cheated on his wife and betrayed his best friend. He longed for freedom from ego but was devastated when his work wasn't praised. And that, perhaps, is the most human thing about him. In the posthumous tributes, many tried to simplify his legacy, to box him in as the spiritual one, or the gentle Beatle. But that framing does a disservice to the reality. Because George Harrison was never just one thing. He was a mosaic of contradictions. He could be deeply kind, but also cuttingly aloof. He could radiate wisdom, then vanish into self-indulgence. He could write songs that healed others, even while he himself remained broken. And in those contradictions, we find something rawer than perfection: authenticity. We live in a culture obsessed with clean narratives, heroes and villains, saints and sinners. But George Harrison refused to be edited like that. He wasn't the enlightened guru people projected onto him, nor was he the bitter, detached loner that some feared he had become. He was something else entirely. A man who walked through the fires of fame and loss and art and still tried, however imperfectly, to find peace. It's tempting to view Harrison's life as a cautionary tale about the limits of spiritual pursuit in a material world. But that reading misses the nuance. He didn't fail at being spiritual. He simply struggled, like all of us, to reconcile his ideals with his instincts. And that struggle, that tension, is what gave his music its resonance. When you hear "All Things Must Pass," it's not just a song about endings. It's a confession, a reminder that even beauty fades, even gods stumble, and even men who chant OM still bleed. What lingers about Harrison is not a single song or a single scandal. It's the atmosphere he created, the space he held open in a band driven by ego. The path he paved toward inner life in a culture addicted to the outer one. In that way, George Harrison wasn't the quiet Beatle because he had nothing to say. He was quiet because he was listening to something most of us are too busy to hear. And maybe that's the legacy that truly matters. A reminder that behind every chord, every silence, every contradiction, there is a person trying to make sense of the noise. When someone dies as privately as George Harrison did, there's a temptation to fill the silence they leave behind with meaning, especially the kind of meaning we want to hear. We call it closure, but really, it's mythology in real time. The media took his final moments and distilled them into a spiritual finale, the enlightened one departing in a blaze of light. Wife and son by his side. Karma resolved. Life complete. But here's a more uncomfortable question: what if that image, however poetic, is only part of the story? What if our desire to believe in the spiritual arc of George Harrison is less about who he really was, and more about what we needed him to be? Let's examine that. From the very beginning, Harrison was branded the Quiet One. It was an identity that stuck, not because it was entirely true, but because it was convenient. In a band where John was the rebel, Paul the romantic, and Ringo the everyman, George became the introvert mystic, and it made sense at the time. He spoke less in interviews. He seemed more contemplative. He didn't court the press. But that label became a shell, both protecting and trapping him. Being the quiet one gave Harrison cover, but it also made him invisible. In the Beatles machine, image mattered as much as music. George's quietness became synonymous with passivity. His rare outbursts or eccentricities were dismissed or misunderstood, and his deep desire to be taken seriously as a songwriter, as a thinker, was repeatedly ignored. This wasn't just about public perception. It bled into the band's internal dynamics. Harrison was often treated like a junior partner in the creative process. McCartney, in particular, was notorious for micromanaging studio sessions, sometimes reducing George's contributions to mere background texture. Even Lennon, who often championed raw individuality, was known to minimize Harrison's songs during track selection. To the public, Harrison was mysterious. To his bandmates, he was manageable. But the truth? He was neither. He was simmering. And that simmer turned into a slow, persistent burn. It's no coincidence that George's most impactful songwriting happened in the final years of the Beatles' existence, when the internal structure of the band was starting to fracture. Songs like While My Guitar Gently Weeps weren't just artistic achievements, they were statements of independence. His voice, both literally and metaphorically, had grown stronger. The others couldn't ignore him anymore, but they didn't fully embrace him either. When All Things Must Pass exploded after the Beatles' breakup, the reaction was revealing. Critics were stunned. Fans were caught off guard. The idea that Harrison had been sitting on that much brilliance all along made people question everything they thought they knew about the Beatles' internal ecosystem. Was George always this good? Or had he simply been edited out? This sparked a quiet reappraisal that continues today. People began to revisit his Beatles-era songs with new ears, songs like Long, 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 or I Me Mine, and ask why they hadn't been recognized sooner. It wasn't that those songs lacked quality. It's that the machinery around them didn't know what to do with them. But reappraisal can swing too far in the opposite direction. In recent years, there's been a tendency to deify Harrison, to turn him into a kind of secular saint, a man who saw through the madness of fame, who walked away with grace, who elevated rock music with sitars and soul. And while there's truth in that narrative, it can become its own kind of myth-making. Because George Harrison was not a spotless sage. He could be cutting, impatient, even cruel. His spiritual ideals, though sincerely held, didn't always translate into behavior. He once lashed out at a flight attendant for interrupting his meditation, an anecdote that, for many, encapsulates the tension between who he wanted to be and how he actually moved through the world. He also struggled with jealousy, especially in the context of his bandmates' success. For all his talk of detachment, he never fully let go of the hurt caused by being overshadowed. Even in his later interviews, he occasionally slipped in barbed comments about Lennon and McCartney, reminders that old wounds hadn't quite healed. And then there's the issue of gender and relationships, an area where Harrison's contradictions were particularly glaring. He championed Eastern philosophies that emphasized devotion and purity, yet pursued women with a sense of entitlement more in line with Western rock star excess. His treatment of Pattie Boyd, in particular, raises difficult questions. He courted her with intensity, married her with flair, and then abandoned her, emotionally retreating into affairs, gaslighting, and spiritual rationalizations. It's worth asking, if Harrison had been less famous, would those behaviors have been called out more directly? In today's cultural climate, where the legacies of public figures are being reevaluated with sharper lenses, George Harrison occupies a strange space. He's not typically mentioned in the same breath as rock's most problematic figures. But maybe that's because his damage was quieter, more personal, less headline-grabbing, and therefore, easier to ignore. But to ignore it is to miss the point. Because what makes George Harrison's story compelling isn't his perfection. It's his imperfection. He was a man caught between two worlds, the external one of fame and influence, and the internal one of silence and soul-searching. He tried to bring them into harmony. He failed, often, but he never stopped trying. That effort, that ongoing, imperfect pursuit is what separates Harrison from so many of his peers. He didn't chase reinvention for reinvention's sake. He chased meaning, and while he never fully caught it, The music he left behind gives us flashes of what that search looked like from the inside. To understand George Harrison, then, is to accept contradiction. To honor him is not to smooth out the jagged parts of his story, but to acknowledge the man, see in them a mirror of our own contradictions, our own unfinished journeys. If we look closely at the legacy of George Harrison, we see something far more complicated than the typical rock and roll biography. We don't see a rise and fall arc, nor the flamboyant implosions of his more theatrical peers. What we see is a different kind of tragedy, a kind that doesn't erupt, but accumulates. Quietly, slowly. A man slowly peeling away from the very world that once made him a god. George never seemed comfortable with the pedestal that fame provided. Unlike Lennon, who often leaned into provocation, or McCartney, who adapted and reshaped himself for every era, Harrison responded to success by recoiling from it. He didn't weaponize celebrity. He tried to outgrow it. And yet, it followed him through every airport terminal, every press junket, every fan letter asking for a glimpse behind the curtain. The more he pulled away, the more he was pursued. This push-pull created a fundamental tension at the heart of his public life. Harrison longed to be left alone, but his work, his songs, his spiritual inquiries, his moments of brilliance had made him indispensable to a culture starving for authenticity. That contradiction created both reverence and resentment. It drew people in, but it also left them confused. Who was George Harrison? Really? A seeker or a cynic? A healer or a hedonist? And maybe the answer is both. That duality is clearest when we consider how Harrison responded to grief and loss, not just his own, but the world's. After the deaths of John Lennon in 1980 and later Ringo's wife, Maureen, yes, the same woman with whom George had once been entangled, Harrison never gave in to public displays of emotion. He remained largely stoic, but the grief was still there, just directed inward, and sometimes sideways. You can hear it in the music, in tracks like Any Road and Stuck Inside a Cloud, recorded toward the end of his life. There's a quiet sorrow that floats beneath the surface. Not desperation, but resignation. A sense that he had walked this long road only to discover there would be no final revelation. Just more questions. Yet even then, he kept writing, kept playing, kept searching. That's the paradox. For someone who constantly declared the illusion of material success, Harrison never stopped creating. He didn't disappear into a mountain hut or renounce the industry completely. He remained in the world, collaborated, produced, laughed, fought, and in that persistence lies his most radical act, not detachment, but engagement on his own terms. So what does that leave us with? A man who was neither a guru nor a hypocrite, but a human being trying desperately to make meaning in a life that was always louder, faster, and more demanding than he was ever built to endure. And this, perhaps, is why his story still resonates so deeply with those who take the time to look past the surface. George Harrison's life is a mirror held up not just to fame, but to the private battles we all fight when no one is watching. We've all felt overlooked. We've all longed to be taken seriously. We've all wrestled with contradictions between what we believe and how we behave. Harrison didn't hide those conflicts, she just wrapped them in melodies and passed them to the world like letters that he himself couldn't fully open. But society rarely has patience for contradiction. It wants clarity, labels, clean endings. And so, George became the quiet one. A neat title for a messy life. And that's the real tragedy. Not that he suffered or stumbled, but that his depth was often reduced to an adjective. Quiet. As if silence ever meant simplicity. The truth is, Harrison was arguably the most radical of the Beatles. While the others leaned into fame, George questioned it. While the world celebrated ego, he sought transcendence. While others chased hits, He sought peace even when it evaded him. He made mistakes, some cruel, some careless, but he never stopped wrestling with the why behind it all. That struggle, more than any chart position or platinum record, is what defines his legacy. He wasn't perfect, but he was honest. Painfully, sometimes confusingly honest. He died the way he lived, without spectacle, surrounded by love, but not needing applause. And that final act, that quiet withdrawal into the arms of something bigger than himself, may have been the only moment in his life where the peace he sought finally aligned with the image the world had projected onto him for decades. George Harrison didn't need to be the loudest. He just needed to be heard for who he really was. And maybe finally were we ready to listen. So maybe the question isn't whether George Harrison was a saint or a sinner. Maybe the real question is this: what does it mean to search for peace in a world that rewards noise? Because in the end, George Harrison wasn't trying to escape the world, was trying to make sense of it. And in doing so, he left behind more than just music. He left behind a blueprint for contradiction, for discomfort, for humanity. Not a clean legacy, but a real one. He showed us that you can sit in silence and still be screaming inside. That you can write about truth while wrestling with deceit. That enlightenment isn't a destination, it's a constant, brutal process of trying to be better in a world that makes that almost impossible. Maybe that's why his story still haunts us. Because deep down, we all wonder, what parts of ourselves have we silenced in the name of peace? What contradictions have we buried because they don't fit the image we want others to see? Maybe the tragedy isn't that George Harrison was misunderstood, but that he understood us far more than we ever gave him credit for. Thank you for staying with us to the very end of this journey. Don't forget to subscribe to Tragedy Uncovered so you never miss a truth the world tried to bury. We'll see you next time. Stay curious. Stay awake.